So in this video, we want to cover some of the basics of performing a qualitative motion analysis from both a component and composite perspective. I'll talk a little bit about the functional movement screen. I actually have a separate video for this, and introduce you to the concepts of developing and using what's called task or criteria sheets. So what exactly is a qualitative motion analysis? It's one of the first things that we do as a biomechanist. And in fact, if you have played sports, or or even moreover, you actually have been a coach in a particular sport, you've already done a number of these qualitative analyses, right? When you want a basketball player to perform a proper free throw, or a soccer player to do a proper throw in, you know the criteria to which that movement, those specific movements, are judged, right? I work a lot in baseball, particularly in pitching, so I'm going to give an example of overarm throwing. So there are specific aspects of the movement, in this case of throwing, that we look for in order to define what's considered to be proper technique, right? So it describes how the body looks upon visual inspection, right? If we see a player coming in, you just want to videotape that person, or just right there live, you are performing a subjective analysis. And the reason why it's subjective is that you're not making any measurements. We're not quantifying anything. That is a quantitative biomechanical analysis that we're going to discuss in subsequent lectures. But in any analysis, the first thing that we typically do is this qualitative analysis. It's subjective in the sense that it depends on who's performing the analysis, right? So if I were to bring a volleyball player here and I'm not experienced as a volleyball player, or I think my volleyball experience is limited to playing it on the beach, I may not be the best person to judge whether or not this player is able to serve the volleyball or to perform a pass, right? A coach will, or an experienced player will. So that's why typically a qualitative motion analysis is considered to be subjective. And we can include things like what's the position of the player in space, whole body wise, or what's the position of specific parts of the body relative to each other, or relative to a specific point from home plate or from the net, whatever it may be. So it's a qualitative analysis that takes on mainly one or two or both approaches. One's called the composite approach, and the other one's called component approach. A composite approach is when we're looking at the entire body, or we may be concentrating on specific parts of the body, but concentrating on the interaction of those body segments to perform a specific task. Whereas a component approach, we're concentrating on focusing on a particular body part through the stages of that movement task. So a composite approach, as I mentioned, is a total body approach. We want to see how the player or a patient is able to develop what we call mature technique. Whether it's walking, whether it's running, or as I mentioned, overarm throwing. And we want to know what are the interactions of all the body parts, the primary body movers, in order to successfully achieve a movement task. So we can divide the movement into separate stages and tasks, and we can concentrate on specific body parts. But in a composite approach, we want to know what's the interaction of all those body parts in order to achieve that task. In my previous lecture, I introduced the concept of a kinetic chain. In the body, the energy through which an athlete is able to create or generate enough energy to throw a football or to run requires proper coordination of all the body segments to achieve that goal, right? And that the kinetic chain is that link segments, if you will, through which energy flows. So I'm going to use the overarm throwing as an example, and even though baseball pitching is kind of my bread and butter, is what I use is what I typically perform research in. Everyone throws. Evolution has showed us that we were hunters and gatherers at one point as a species, so we had to learn how to throw spears and different implements. So as a young child, all of us learn how to throw something, and the first stage of throwing is just simply what's called a chop throw. You just simply use your arm to throw a ball. There's no movement of the feet, no spinal rotation, what they call pelvis and trunk rotation. So the first stage is just simply throwing with your arm, right? And so as the thrower develops in terms of experience, they then advance to stage 2 and subsequently to stage 3, 4, and 5. And within each stage, you can see how different body parts that primarily are involved in the throw begins to develop in terms of rotation. So let's say, for example, stage 2, what we call block rotation. That means that the upper torso is beginning to rotate with respect to the pelvis, the hips, the shoulders, the shoulder joint, the elbow, all begin to rotate in a proximal to distal fashion. I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail here because I've got a separate lecture just on throwing alone. But ultimately, this leads to a sequence of segmental body rotations in order to achieve, in this case, throwing the ball. What we just did here is a composite approach, because even though I describe specific body parts, I'm describing them in the context of what the entire body is doing in order to throw a baseball, to throw a ball. You think about throwing a punch, right? You're able to create more power of a punch. If you're boxing, if you're an MMA fan, if you use your core, if you use your pelvis and trunk more. And that involves this sequence of rotation in order to create that momentum that's needed for a proper punch. Okay, so that was a composite approach. In terms of a component approach, now we're focusing mainly on a specific body part. Although we are advancing through the various phases or stages of the movement itself, what we're doing with a component approach is we're focusing on the feet, the trunk, the pelvis, the shoulder, and specifically focusing on that in order to correct any deficiency in the movement itself. So performers could show evidence of what's called mature skill performance in one particular body part. I'm going to show you here in a sec of an overarm thrower, and one thing we can concentrate on first is the trunk. I mentioned earlier that the trunk is the power of the throw of a punch, throwing a football, throwing a baseball, and we know what kind of rotations are needed in order to properly throw the ball. What we found out through research and just from visual observations is that one, trunk rotation, right? Internal, external rotation of the trunk. Number 2, trunk flexion. Right, this is this movement right here in the sagittal plane. And number 3 is the timing in which trunk rotation occurs. So we can create what's called a set of criteria, or a criteria sheet, that we can check mark to determine whether this thrower is able to move their trunk in such a way that defines biomechanically efficient throw. And that's just for the trunk. So what we did right here is a qualitative analysis from a component approach, from a component perspective, because we're only concentrating in this case on the trunk itself. So let's take a look at a thrower here. I believe this was a 13-year-old kid that we saw in our bullpen a couple of years ago. This kid's probably in middle school by now, or a freshman in high school. And typically what we see with younger players is they tend to open up too early, what baseball coaches like to call opening up too early towards home plate. And what that really means is, we're talking in terms of the trunk, is that the trunk itself rotates too early in the sequence. So I'm going to pause this action here right about I missed it, sorry about that. Back up just a little bit to what's called front foot contact, and I apologize for the resolution here is not the greatest. Right about there. So notice that the pelvis squares up towards home plate first. We're supposed to square up towards home plate, but the trunk here is beginning to rotate as well. And typically for mature throwers, they're able to maintain that trunk's position while the pelvis is opening up towards home plate, and it creates what's called an X. and an X is it's like an X factor in golf. If you look at a transverse view of a thrower and you were to draw a line between the ASISs or between the hips as well as through the shoulder, it creates an X. And the longer that a thrower is able to maintain that X during the pitching cycle, they're able to, it's almost like a rubber band. They're able to create enough potential energy that is released during the acceleration phase during throwing. And what younger players tend to do is they tend to open up too early. They tend to have early trunk rotation, and thereby they release a lot of that energy too soon. And what happens typically, and I'm kind of going off topic here a little bit, is they tend to make up for or try to compensate for that lack of energy transfer towards the throwing arm by activating the shoulder muscles a lot sooner than they should in order to maximize ball velocity. And they're able to do so, but they do so at a cost of increasing the stress at the shoulder and elbow. So the efficiency of the throw goes down. So if we're concentrating on trunk, what coaches and trainers tend to do is we try to train our young players in order to maintain their trunk in that position as long as possible. And we're talking just a few milliseconds here and during the pitch cycle, in combination with strength and conditioning. So as they get stronger, as they get more functional, apt to throw a baseball, they tend to delay that trunk a little bit more. So anyway, that's kind of a long-winded analysis of trunk rotation. But that is a qualitative motion analysis from a component approach, because in this case, the component is the trunk itself. Okay, moving along. Like I said, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on the functional movement screen. I have a separate video for the FMS. But if you look at the FMS, it's a battery of tests that test movement patterns in terms of the balance of mobility and stability. And in fact, it was initially used on high school athletes as a screening tool. Now we use it for all kinds of applications in corrective exercise and training and rehab, for example. And it's just essentially a battery of tests. And each one of these tests are graded on a scale, let's say in this, for example, for a deep squat between 1 and 3. And you'll notice here, this is a perfect example, what I'm going to talk about here in a sec, of a task or criteria sheet, where there are certain criteria that the athlete or patient has to meet in order to achieve a score of 2 or of a 3. So in this test, this movement pattern test for a deep squat, a 3 is indicated by, for example, the torso is parallel with the tibia or toward the vertical. You can see here it is more of almost a vertical alignment of the trunk with respect to the vertical plane here, vertical line. Femur is below horizontal. That means basically the femur, the angle of knee is greater than 90 degrees. Actually, in this case, greater than 120 degrees. Knees do not track inside the feet, called varus valgus at the knee here, and the dowel is aligned over feet as shown here. And if you ever perform this deep squat task, it's not easy. In fact, try doing this with a dowel and try to maintain that position or try to achieve that position. And I just tried this recently, as maybe a couple weeks ago, and then I got it too. And the reason being is that I can't perform this position or get my trunk in this position without a block here. It's because I don't have good range of motion in terms of plantar dorsiflexion at the ankle. I have tight plantar flexors. So this is a perfect example of performing a qualitative analysis of the deep squat. Now, based on what you see here of the criteria for 1, 2, and 3, would you say that this is more of a composite or component approach? So if you select the composite approach, you're exactly right. Because if you look at it, we're looking at simply at the knees, we're looking at the femur position, the torso position. Even though those are specific body parts, we want to know how do all of those in combination perform, in this case, a deep squat. Right? And so there are a number of different squats. Like I said, I have a separate video for this that talks about the various movement patterns that are tested in the FMS, but it's a perfect example of an application of qualitative motion analysis. So what I just showed you is an example of a task sheet. It's essentially just a criteria list of a given movement task that ultimately determines what's considered biomechanically efficient, proper execution of the task. I mentioned overhand throwing. This is a task sheet that was created by the physicaleducator.com site. And this is what physical educators use at the high school or middle school levels. And one of the things we look for overhand throwing is, do they stand sideways towards a target? Does the throwing arm cock back with the elbow and shoulder height? Does the person step with the opposite foot? Do the person's hips and spine or trunk rotate as they throw? And is there follow through? So these are very basic criteria that defines proper overhand throwing for a younger player. Now we can obviously adjust this as the person or as the athlete matures in terms of experience as well as skeletal maturity if they become an actual thrower, whether they play football or baseball or track and field, if they're a javelin thrower, for example. And so we can adjust this accordingly. So this is a perfect example of using a task sheet to train someone how to throw, how to properly execute an overhand throw. We can use this for any movement you can think of. I have here an example of a volleyball overhead pass. There are certain positions here and certain criteria by which the overhead pass can be judged. Remember, this is all subjective. It depends on the person that is coaching or applying this this screen or this test. So I would bring in an expert. For example, our TA this semester, Tina, is also an assistant volleyball coach. And so in this next video, she teaches how to basically serve a volleyball and what she calls the standing float serve. And this is the criteria by which that movement, in this case, standing float serve, is judged from the prep phase 1 and 2, toss and contact, and then the follow through. So in this video, you can get an idea, of the movement itself. It's just a very short movement, and the specific components of the movement itself that defines proper execution. So you can take it from either a component approach or a composite approach. Okay, so if you're taking my applied biomechanics class in my labs, one of your first assignments is to choose a movement task. And feel something that you're comfortable with. Any task could be soccer throwing, it could be a free throw, it could be running, whatever. And then also come up with a criterion task sheet such as this that defines proper execution of that task. So anyway, check out this video.
Hi class, this is Tina. Today I will be showing you how to perform a basic overhand float serve in volleyball. The first thing that I'm going to do, I'm going to make sure that my feet are in parallel. And the first step that I will take is a step with my left leg, step forward. Now I'm serving with my right arm, but if you're left-handed, your first step would be with your right leg. So step with the left leg, then I hold the ball in my left hand, making sure that it's nice and straight. So this is all the preparation and step forward phase. Someone also likes to use, actually a lot of people like to use the bow and arrow technique, in which the bow would be your straight arm where you're holding the ball, and then the arrow would be your serving arm. So step forward with my left leg. Then again, I'm also making sure that my right leg is at about 45-degree angle, and opening my hips up will allow me to serve faster and stronger, because if you serve like this, the ball will just end a couple of meters in front of you. So once again, step forward. I'm pulling my right arm, serving arm, all the way back, open hips, and I'm going to try to make a very high point of contact and in front of me. This is why my toss needs to be not in front of my tossing arm, but a little bit more to the right side, so in front of my serving arm. So once again, and you hit. When you hit the ball, you want to make sure high point of contact, and when you hit, that's where you stop your swing. This is going to allow the ball to float, and it will be very tricky for the passers to pass this ball. Now I will perform all of this stuff continuously so that you can see what it looks like. One more thing to note is that when you have contact with the ball, you want to make contact with 5 points, so all 5 fingers and full hand. So when you smack the ball, it's going to be very loud. This is why in the preparation phases for serve, some people like to smack the ball a couple of times just to get that feel. So yeah, I hope this was helpful.